Right, greetings, hello. So welcome to the philosophy class for this week, and it's the 20th of November, very exciting day in the calendar. We're coming up to the dark midwinter, which here in La Creuse is, it's always quite intense. We have very warm summers and we also have fairly cold winters. It's been pretty chilly the last few days. But we've also got Christmas to look forward to, and that's quite a big thing. We have the mayor put up his tree with the lights on and everyone, chills out. So Christmas is also fun. And that's what I'm going to be talking about today. What is Christmas? Why do we celebrate it? Who is Christ? And I'm going to be doing the second part of my philosophy class on Christianities. I use the plural because there are so many different varieties and it's so interesting. And I've been studying and teaching this stuff for years, so it's fascinating to be able to share with it. Here in Betet, little old sleepy Betet. What I'm going to do, what I've decided to do, because it's such a complex field, I want to try and cover the entire. Last week we looked at the sort of currents of what was around in Jesus' life and how we know what source evidence we have, the Gospels, the Gnostic writings, archaeology. How can we recapture what Jesus himself was like? There's obviously no portraits of him have come down, even though St. Luke was supposed to be an artist, but we don't have any actual icons that were done at the time. And anyway, they might not have survived given, weather conditions. Although it's still possible, something might turn up. So I'm a great believer in peace. We can get peace in the entire Holy Land, all the way from Egypt through to Turkey and Iran, and I'm sure new archaeological discoveries will come about. One of the reasons I hate war so much is it destroys our collective memory and destroys the traces of the past. So what I've decided, we looked at last week, the evidence, the Gospels, the basic narrative story. What I'm going to look at now is all the different varieties of Christianity that have come about. Because from that sort of explosion of light, let's call it an enlightenment explosion, which Christ was teaching, then all these pockets of response happened around the world. I remember once being on the island of Iona, in the northwest of Scotland, where a very famous abbey was set up by St. Columba, who was a great Celtic Christian, a kind of Druid Christian. And I was looking around the abbey and I noticed a cross, which was really ancient, from very early times, made of granite. And I could see the stone sparkling with light. And I wrote a poem about it because I thought, it's incredible that a guy being crucified in the Middle East, 600 years before Iona was founded, then people are making crosses out of granite, like 600 years later, in a remote part of northwest Scotland, in an island, which took years to carve out of granite. How do you carve granite? I mean, it's really difficult. So the poem was about how that supernatural explosion, let's call it, the Christ story, then left its imprint on people's minds, imaginations, and even in stone, all over the world. So anyway, that's what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at that imprint, those explosions. And I've decided to do it using the periodic table, which is the tool designed for this purpose. And we're going to look at the different categories of Christianity, one by one. And I'll do a summary of what that one's about, where it comes from, what its history is. And all this data can be double-checked on the website, which is the periodic table website. And if you don't have a copy of the periodic table and you work in a school or a student, then you should get one on your classroom wall or seminar room, because it's unique. Right, so the first one we're going to do today is, could you just do me a favour and pass my glasses from that table? I know the other set, annoyingly. Apologies about that. I forgot them. I'll take the count. Thanks. Great. Super duper. I'll probably need to refer to a few things. Okay, so we're going to look first at box number 33. The Christianities are all pale blue boxes in the periodic table. And they, there's two main categories of them, two main batches. The first one's in small, 33 up to 58. And then there's a jump, and then there's a second row. And the reasoning behind that is because Christianity is both very ancient, but also very modern. There are many modern types of Christianity. And we're going to try and cover them all in these two classes, really. So number 33 is what's called the Orthodox Church. Now, Orthodox is a Greek word, meaning straight to the truth, actually. It's a nice word. I like it. And it was a term used by Aristotle to describe his philosophy, and we looked at Aristotelian thought a while back. Aristotle said, don't beat around the bush. If you can go straight to the truth using logic and analysis, then do it. Don't sort of make up complicated journeys. So Orthodox Christianity, taking its leaf from Aristotle's book, grew out of Greek thinking. It uses the Greek New Testament. The Greek-speaking world was inspired to become Orthodox, really from the beginning, because as I said in my talk last week, Jesus himself undoubtedly spoke Greek, as well as Hebrew and Aramaic, and some Latin. And many of the disciples would have had conversations with him in Greek. So some of the scriptures are written down in Greek. So Luke's Gospel was probably first written in Greek. Some of Paul's letters that we'll look at were written in Greek. And so the Orthodox Church began from Jesus' own teachings to his students, who were called mathematici, meaning students, not mathematicians, but it's the same root. And they wanted to preserve it, so they wrote the Gospels down. Luke's, particularly as a historian, is invaluable, and he wrote a second book, the Acts, which tells the story of Jesus' life and work in launching the early Christian church after the crucifixion. And St. Paul, who had this mystical experience of the risen Jesus, as did many other of the early disciples, starting with Mary Magdalene, who may have been his consort, certainly a very close disciple. And after he'd been crucified and laid to rest in a tomb, she went there and found the stone rolled away, and the place where he should be lying was empty. Where is Jesus? Where have they taken him? And she had this mystical experience because she then saw him without realizing it was him at first, because of course in her mind he was dead. But he was actually resurrected back to life. And there's some very, very great mysteries about this. I have here a wonderful book, The Healing Wisdom of Mary Magdalene. And I have a huge collection of books on Mary Magdalene, because I set up the Mary Magdalene Studies Association here in France. The idea is, if we really want to understand Jesus' teachings and what his life stood for, we ought, out of respect, to go to Mary Magdalene, as well as the ones that we've got the official Gospels of. She only left this fragment of Mary Magdalene Gospel, but it's very valuable. It's a Gnostic Gospel. So I think it clinches the fact that Jesus was a Gnostic, a teacher of wisdom, we would say. Gnosis meaning the higher form of wisdom or enlightenment. So his teaching was so powerful that even death couldn't stop it. Now that's pretty extraordinary. I mean, I've been a teacher a long time, but I don't think I'm going to go on teaching after death. That would be a special dispensation. I don't know where you get the legitimacy from the authorities for that, but somehow Jesus was able to break through death. And his disciples, felt they were still communing with him inwardly. Now, there are all kinds of mysteries. Was that, did his physical body resurrect? Was he just, comatose and then he revived, like a near-death experience? that does happen from time to time. And of course, medical science wasn't that far advanced. So if that was what happened, if Jesus had been taken out from the cross, not completely dead medically, or kind of appearing to be dead, but then revived, like a near-death experience, well, now we know that can happen. So that could have happened in Jesus' case. In which case, he would have had a physical body walking about, continuing with his teaching. By tradition, he took the disciples back up to Galilee, carried on teaching a bit, and then, then vanished for a second time. And there are different theories about where he vanished to the second time. The official church teaches that he rose bodily into heaven, and that his disciples were all gathered on a hill, and they watched him going up like a sort of spaceship. That's one hypothesis. The question is like, where did he go? And then there's another question, which is maybe he wasn't actually physically resurrected in his body, but it was like a spiritual body, like in Buddhism we call it the diamond, or the rainbow body. So it was his etheric body, his aura, which I think we all have, and that was so strong that it was able to project and appear like, hello, I'm Jesus back. But it was only his, like a hologram. It was a hologram projected, like in Star Wars movies, not the actual physical thing. That's also possible. And I've got large literature of speculations on that, and there's research going on. The fact is we actually don't know. But what I think we can affirm and do know is that something strange happened, that his death wasn't the end of the teachings, and his irrepressible life force carried on, in some way, shape or form that science hasn't fully understood yet. And this explains why there were so many communities of disciples came into existence. One of the first was in Antioch, where St. Luke came from. St. Paul was responsible for creating some of these communities. He was initially a persecutor of the early church. He didn't like the Christians because it was really embarrassing for him to be hearing these people going around about a Messiah's come. He was part of the official establishment, which didn't want too much knowledge to leak out to ordinary people, peasants, farmers, fishermen. I mean, are you kidding? They're just peasants, was the attitude of the elite, and it still is. So he was actually employed by the temple authorities to silence these Christians. They were troublesome. And his job was to go around and kill them. Like, he would give them a warning and say, if you don't stop preaching about Jesus, we're going to have to arrest you and have you killed off. It was a bit like the Stalinist times, where if you weren't preaching the right kind of thing, you were bumped off. And, in the Great Terror, Stalin killed about 600,000 people like that, had them shot. I mean, St. Paul wasn't on that level, but he was for his day and time, he was a gangster. He was sent to Damascus by the authorities to go and arrest a bunch more Christians, because they were known to be hiding out there. And on the way, he had this extraordinary experience, which he later reported in his writings and letters, which fundamentally changed him as a human being. Because he was on the way to go and kill Christians, and then just when he was nearing Damascus, he suddenly saw this blinding, flashing light appear. And he heard this voice, which he identified with Christ's own voice, saying, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Presumably in Greek. Could have been in Hebrew. And, it like hit him like a thunderbolt. It's a very interesting account, this, because there are similar accounts in world literature when bad people suddenly get a sort of download that they shouldn't be bad anymore. We can call it a conversion experience, which is one of the terms, or just a sort of attack of conscience. I wish more of these things happened. I wish they happened more often. Because a lot of bad people do a lot of bad things, but sometimes they have a wake-up call and a conscience attack. That's what Paul had. He fell off his horse and was then led into the town of Damascus, and he'd gone blind. He could no longer see this flashing light. The had blinded him. It's a very interesting account, and I believe it to have been a true account and a true story. So he then was taken into the town, and this is the incredible irony of history, which is that the very people he was about to persecute and kill actually looked after him. There was one particular chap, he was like directed, to take succour with the very people he was about to go and persecute. It's like a senior Nazi suddenly supposed to go and round up the Jews of Budapest or whatever, and then going blind, having a conscience attack, and then taking refuge with some of the Jews hiding in the cellars and things. It's a very moving story, and he gradually met some of the leading disciples. After some time, one of the main Christians in Damascus came and healed him miraculously, because he'd seen in a dream that this guy Saul, who was called Saul before, was going to come and needed some healing. So God, however you want to understand that, sent this guy a dream, which then he went and healed Paul. As he then changed his name he stopped calling himself Saul, and he called himself Paul, which means the little one, the small one. And he totally changed his personality. So instead of being a persecutor of Christians, he became one. And he then embarked on a very amazing career of teaching and, spiritual witness, prayer. He travelled all over different parts of Greece. He went to Macedonia. He went to Arabia. Not quite sure what that meant. It's interesting. He spent some time in the desert. I think he was so stunned by what he'd experienced, he had to just go off and be alone and live in the desert for a while. He also went back to his hometown of Tarsus, which was in the little bit where Turkey joins Syria. And it was a famous city for the Stoic traditions. Paul was an intellectual, and he spoke fluent Greek and wrote it, and he'd studied philosophy, he'd studied ideas and stuff. So wherever he went, he was able to get an audience. He travelled throughout that part of the world, went back and forth to Jerusalem a few times, and also then travelled as far as most of the cities of Greece. He went to Athens, Thessalonica, which I've been to up in the northern part of Greece, north of that to Macedonia, and then all over Turkey. It was called then Anatolia, or Asia Minor. And then eventually, and he wouldn't shut up. People kept trying to silence him. The Jews didn't like him in the official temple cult because he'd betrayed them. He'd supposed to be employed and working for them to crush the Christians. Now he'd become one of them. And of course that was like, the worst thing you could do as far as they were concerned. So they tried to get the Romans to have him killed and arrested and punished. And they tried to incite mobs against him. And there were several hair-raising near misses when a mob would go for him and try and stone him to death and God knows what. He was arrested a few times and, whipped and so on, like had physical chastisement in the prison cell for being a rabble-rouser. Anyway, it all came to a head, and he meanwhile kept writing his letters, and Christianity was an intellectual movement as well as just a sort of emotional movement, and Paul was at the hub of that. So the Jews were determined, no, he's got to go, he's got to be killed. And he was arrested yet again. A mob was going to attack him. It was in Jerusalem. And he said, no, you can't do this, I'm a Roman citizen. Which was like, not everyone in the Roman Empire was a Roman citizen. He'd inherited it from his father. I'm a free-born Roman citizen, he said. I appeal to Caesar. And these local courts didn't have the right to try him because he was a significant person. And so the local Roman authority guards put a cordon around him and got him out of the mob. saved his life actually, and took him to Caesarea, which is on the coast. I've been there, it's an amazing archaeological site, which was the headquarters of the Roman occupation in Palestine as it then was. And they put him under house arrest, and the chief Roman authority in Palestine said, like, what's all this about you being a Roman citizen? Is it true? And Paul was able to prove it. And so then it meant he had to be sent to Rome for trial. In fact, there's a weird thing, because the procurator guy said, well, why don't you just, like, if I'd have known that, I would never have taken it this far. I mean, let's just drop the charges, right? Because you don't seem to have done anything wrong. I mean, you were just like preaching, weren't you, like a philosopher? But Paul did a silly thing, and I don't fully understand it, but there we are. History is weird. He said, no, I insist on going to Rome. I want to be tried. I want to be found not guilty. And I want to clear my name entirely. And if you just drop the charges now, that won't happen. So send me to Rome. I think that was a mistake, but there we are. Paul didn't lose all his stubbornness just because he became Christian. His personality was still a bit cantankerous, in my opinion. And that's a side of it. Anyway, he was shipped to Rome. The journey there was incredibly complex. He had a number of shipwrecks, survived with his life only a couple of times, usual old stuff. And eventually ends up in Italy, goes to Rome, and, sort of knocks on the door of the courts and says, arrest me, I'm Paul, you must have heard of me. I've got these charges, I want to clear my name. So they put him under house arrest, just to do the formality, and they thought it was going to be a done deal, but everyone thought, yeah, good man, he's come, just go through the motions. And he was able, in his house arrest, he was there for 2 or 3 years, to write some of the most moving letters. He wrote some letters to the Corinthians, and these are classics of European literature. They've influenced thinking and philosophy for 2,000 years ever since, and so they're worth reading. And he uses images from the Stoic tradition, from philosophy. He tries to give instruction on, how you should be a good Christian. So he becomes the sort of main teacher of Christianity after Jesus that we know of. I mean, it's very probable that others in the early group of apostles were great teachers, but we don't have their records. We have the Gospels, but they weren't designed. They tell the story, as it were. But anyway, Paul's teachings are very important, and they're really, you can mine them for insights. Here's an example. You may not be familiar with any of this. The Spirit, this is from his letter to the Corinthians, which was a great city in Greece. He's in prison in Rome. He's writing. He's in a house arrest, and he's writing, has, parchment and whatever it was to write with. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. And we should remember, of course, that Paul was versed in Judaism. He was an intellectual. He'd done his study of the Kabbalah. I'm 100% certain. He'd studied with a particular rabbi called Gamaliel, who was a mystic. He knew the biblical writings in depth, but he wanted more. So he'd gone to the esoteric traditions, which we call the Kabbalah. And I think this is why he recognized Jesus was coming from that same place eventually, and why he was accepting the label Christian. So he knew all about the Holy Spirit, the Ruach HaKodesh, that we looked at when we covered the Kabbalah, a few weeks ago. And that you're not supposed to read the scriptures in a literal way. You're supposed to read it mystically, esoterically, with your full consciousness, because it's ultimately a narrative about consciousness evolving through history. Okay, back to the text. The Spirit searches all things, even the deep things of God. For who among men knows the thoughts of man, except the man's spirit within him? In the same way, no one knows the thoughts of God except the Spirit of God. We have not received the Spirit of the world, but the Spirit who is from God, that we may understand what God has freely given us. Well, this is astounding stuff and really interesting, because philosophy up to that point was sort of on a horizontal thing. You know, I studied with Plato, you studied with Aristotle. Oh, this is what I learned. Oh, that's what you learned. Okay, let's compare notes. It's all very horizontal, right? What Paul is saying is that the Spirit of the Creator, God, has now come into history and actually brought some updates of information direct through the work of Christ's teachings and the church. And that this Spirit of God is now trying to get through the insights of the wisdom behind creation. This is what we speak, not in words taught us by human wisdom, but in words taught us by the Spirit, expressing spiritual truths in spiritual words. Well, that's the writing of someone that's done the Kabbalah course. And he's been able to plug into the root source of wisdom, which is the same place Jesus was saying to Thomas, if you recall, when we looked at the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas. Jesus said, yeah, okay, you've got it because you plugged into the bubbling stream of wisdom. You've gone direct to the source. Well, Paul is saying here, so have I. I, Paul, little old Paul, who used to be a really naughty chap, persecuting Christians, I've plunged into the stream of absolute spiritual consciousness. And what I'm saying now doesn't come from me, my ego. It's not what I was taught. No, this comes direct from source. The man without the Spirit does not accept the things that come from the Spirit of God. And they're foolishness to him. And he cannot understand them because they're spiritually discerned. Well, we've all had that experience. If you try and have a deep conversation with a certain type of people, they just look at you like you're crazy and, what are you talking about? Nonsense. Let's go and watch telly, They're not interested in the vertical dimension of existence. They're not interested in the meaning of life, or the nature of God or anything. No, that's all just, I'm not interested in that. I've got to pay the mortgage. I just work and watch telly and that's it. And so Paul knew all about that. If you say, well, what I'm saying comes from the Spirit of God, you're laughed at in certain quarters, not everywhere. The spiritual man makes judgments about all things, but he himself is not subject to any man's judgment. Again, a hugely important text. You could write a whole thesis on that would make a great PhD, because the one who does speak from the Spirit of God, in a sense, is beyond human laws, beyond human-made judgments. I don't know, there's probably a law somewhere that, one shouldn't teach with the lamp too near the student, or you can get arrested and the school shut down. When I worked in formal education institutions, there are all kinds of silly laws like that. You can't do this, you can't do that, or you come under judgment, right? And some of them are sensible, they're quite good, but it's gone too far, and there's all kinds of restrictions on actually being an educator these days. And I think what Paul is saying here is that if you actually have wisdom to share, you should be empowered to do it by society. But of course it doesn't. It restricts it. And in some countries you're not even allowed to teach about spirituality. Religious studies was off the curriculum in the Marxist Soviet Empire, except in certain high-level intellectual circles where you could discuss it from a historical or archaeological perspective. But ordinary schools, no, it was off the agenda. And they enforced that in Poland and places. So religious studies was banned from the curriculum because the official ideology of Marxism didn't allow for anything beyond matter to exist. And in China, I think that's still the case. I'm not sure in the Chinese educational curriculum, I don't think they get instruction in the different religious and philosophical traditions like we're trying to do here, which I think is to their own impoverishment. It would be a good thing if the Chinese education authorities adopted the periodic table as their teaching device and used it in all the schools, because it is a scientific tool, and I think Chinese children, as much as Americans or Europeans, have a right to know all this stuff. Certainly, and all the Chinese philosophies and religions are part of it. Anyway, so then to finish this passage, Paul goes on and says, "For who has known the mind of the Lord, that he may instruct him? But we have the mind of Christ." I mean, what Paul is saying, if you decode it, is like, I've been doing deep meditation and prayer. I've been communing with this extraordinary spiritual Kabbalistic rabbi called Jesus Christ, and he's downloading stuff into me, which I'm now saying. I have the mind of Christ. The nous, the term in Greek of Christou, the noun, in fact, the mind of Christ, which comes from the word nous, which is the word of intellect in Greek philosophy. So, again, it's more evidence to me that Christ was not just teaching a sort of country bumpkin type of shallow thing, like just have faith and everything will be fine. No, he was actually demanding the students actually think, use their intellect. And what's extraordinary is that even after he's dead, he's somehow able to go on doing that. Right, so that's Paul. And then, just to finish with Paul, the bad news is that, tragedy of history, is that he ends up in Rome just at the time when Nero is the emperor, who was one of the most evil, ignorant, stupid, and megalomaniac political leaders the world's ever known in any culture at any time. Like the complete opposite of everything Jesus stood for and Paul. He believed in like total excess and violence, and as the emperor he was used to seeing people tortured and killed with no real legal basis. He was a great practitioner of lust and sexual excess with men and women and boys and girls, and he was just had no self-control, no self-discipline, which is very sad because he had quite a good tutor, Seneca, a philosopher. But towards the end of his life, I think he went mad, Nero, and he started having people persecuted for no reason. And then Rome caught fire. He had these megalomaniac building projects. He's going to redo all this part of the city, and he wanted to build himself a golden palace. So he knocked down, thousands of people's houses to make way for his big project. Sometime, for some reason that historians still argue about, Rome caught fire, and it burned for like a couple of weeks, and it burned at least about a third of the city. People died. The fire brigade was not very well organised. They tried to put it out and failed, and it just burned itself out. He went and stood on the top of his other palace on a hill, at a safe distance, and watched it burning, and played his lyre, and slightly demented, said, "I'm the greatest emperor has ever been. Look, I'm watching the city burning, and isn't it incredible?" He made up a song about it. Now, some people argue